Welcome to the EACC's EU Economic Update, Forged in Crisis, How the War in Ukraine May Strengthen the European Union and the Transatlantic Relationship. This event is organized by the European American Chamber of Commerce, New York, with support of the European delegation, actually the European Commission, and together with the European delegation in the United States. My name is Yvonne Bendinger-Rothschild. I'm the Executive Director of the EACC New York, and I will be your host for today's program, as well as moderating the conversation. My conversation partners include Balázs Pakiani. He's the Counselor for Economic and Financial Affairs, and his colleague, Ben Carlina, the Senior Economist, both at the EU delegation to the United States. And we have a special guest, Sander Turdois, the advisor at the ECB, representative office at the IMF, based in Washington, of the European Central Bank. We have a lot to talk about, so let's dive right into it. So despite entering the year on a weak note, the outlook for the EU economy before the Russian invasion of Ukraine was looking like a robust expansion. Challenges still coming out of the pandemic, but we were registering headwinds despite the lasting supply chain challenges. Energy prices and commodity shortages, were assumed to be fading, but what has changed and where are we now? Ben, do you want to get us started?
Thanks, Yvonne. I'm going to start sharing my screen. Can you guys see that?
Yep.
Okay, great. So yeah, as you were saying, as at the beginning of the year, things were really looking up. We were expecting the beginning of a really prolonged and robust expansion. There were a lot of tailwinds as the economy reopened from the pandemic, and people were feeling good. But as you said, the invasion of Ukraine really scrambled the forecast, and apart from all the uncertainty it's introduced, it's a war that is in Europe, right on the doorstep of the European Union. And so I thought I'd set the stage a little bit by talking about how some of these channels work, how the effect of the war is directly impacting the European economy. Now, of course, the biggest impact is from this commodity price shock that was unleashed, because Russia and Ukraine are both major producers of a host of raw materials. I mean, obviously Russia is famous for being a huge energy exporter, but it's not just energies, it's all kinds of industrial metals and agricultural goods and the building blocks that all kinds of goods are made with. So we'll talk more about that a bit later, but that's not the only linkage, right? I mean, first of all, there are trade and supply chain linkages with Russia and Ukraine, and the EU is, more broadly integrated into global trade and the global economy, very deeply. And so what that means is that the shock from this war, the contraction in GDP in Russia and Ukraine, and also the spillovers to the rest of the world, means that there's going to be less demand for European exports in the short to medium term. And in the longer term, depending on how things play out, there could even be some damage to this system of globalization that we've had, expanding over the past generation or longer. Another one is that I want to mention is all the refugees. Europe has already absorbed about 5 million refugees from Ukraine, a little bit more. And, in the short term, this has, pretty significant costs for many European countries, and not just in money, but in terms of logistical challenges, just organizing housing and medical care and schools and things like that for everyone who's coming over. Again, if the war drags on for a long time, some of these people might end up staying. I think, the expectation still is that most of them will go back. They want to go back. Many of them have stayed in neighboring countries that are quite close to home. But if they do stay, that could even be a net positive for Europe, given that they will progressively be integrated into the labor market, and Europe has these demographic challenges that would be helped by this. Another one is that you can see here is the financial market linkages. Financial conditions have been tightening recently. Now, personally, I would probably argue that a lot of that has to do with the onset of the Federal Reserve's tightening cycle in the United States. But some of it is related to the uncertainties launched by the war, and also just implementing sanctions and seizing Russian assets and divesting European investments in Russia have costs. And it's hard to know what the long-term implications of all the sanctions are for international payment systems and capital flows and things like that. But finally, I just want to emphasize that a lot of these short-term economic costs, they're the result of the Western response to the war, right? The US and Europe are choosing to implement sanctions. The EU is choosing to take steps to reduce its demand for Russian natural gas, for example, by 2/3 before the end of the year, and to gain independence from Russian fossil fuels by 2027. So these really are brave decisions in political terms for the EU, because apart from the hit to the Russian economy that these measures will take, it imposes real costs on European households and businesses, but that's the cost of defending freedom and democracy and the rule of law, and so that's what Europe is doing despite these economic costs. So
can I jump in for a second on this? Because I was just going to ask you. I mean, so we're obviously taking a hit, and Europe has been affected by the sanctions much more than the United States. Are there any new policies that we're putting into place to prevent a situation like this happening again, or should we get to that, when we talk about at a little later in the discussion?
Well, I think we should. I'll just flag them right now. I think we can go into them in greater depth. But I mean, obviously, there's the security aspect of things, which I think you see in Finland and Sweden applying to join NATO, for example. But there's also important economic initiatives like Repower EU that was just announced yesterday, that's going to accelerate this energy transition and end the European dependence on Russian fossil fuel imports very rapidly over the next couple of years. And there's all sorts of steps that are going to be taken. So let's come back to that maybe a bit in the future. And in the meantime, maybe let's start with a discussion of inflation and what's causing it. I should say that the spring forecast was just introduced. The main takeaway is that growth projections have gone down and inflation projections have gone up. So let's start a bit with inflation. As you can see here with this chart, energy and commodity prices had already started going up before the war, and this is because of the reopening from the pandemic, and as people went out and did more shopping and did more traveling, there was increased demand for energy and for goods and for stuff. But that dotted line there is the onset of the war, and that caused this immediate short shock, really across the board for energy and commodity prices. And this is because Russia and Ukraine are major exporters of a huge range of these commodities. So just to give some recent numbers, in April in Europe, in the euro area, the energy component of HICP inflation was rising at an annual rate of 38%. That's a huge number, and that's what's driving a lot of what we will see is headline inflation is being driven by energy prices. Now, I also want to say that there's a wide divergence across EU member states in how much energy price inflation in particular they're feeling. I think in the Netherlands, I think it was something like 70% annualized energy inflation in April, whereas in somewhere like Malta, it was almost nothing. And this has to do with both, how dependent you are on imports of Russian energy, but also on whether you have short or long-term contracts for your energy supplies, and how much you've instituted public policies to say cap prices and things like that in the short term. So there's a big divergence, but in general, energy prices are going up a lot. Food prices were up 6.5% year over year in April, and that is likely to continue because if you're a farmer, your input costs are going up. That's mostly energy, but also fertilizer and things like that. And finally, I should add that, in fact, part of this isn't all Russia. Some of this is China, right? Because China's still pursuing zero COVID policies, and recently we've seen because of these new outbreaks and new infections in China, they've been shutting down some major cities, major export zones in China, and that's contributing to the supply chain problems that we can see here. So this is the forecast EU inflation rate over the forecast horizon. Maybe I should just say from the outset that these numbers are not just come up with by economists throwing darts at the wall, but they use futures prices to forecast what's going to happen with inflation over the next couple of years. So even though you see inflation being very high right now, the futures markets do project that energy and commodity prices are set to come down over the next 2 years. We will see how quickly and how rapidly it happens in actual terms once we get the real inflation prints. But for now, you can see that over half of the increase in headline inflation is due to energy. And that is slowly starting to feed through, though, right? Because as you have all these high energy prices, high agricultural prices, all these raw materials, eventually that starts to feed through. So maybe I'll give you a couple numbers and stop and see if you guys have some questions about inflation. But headline inflation in the euro area hit 7.5% in April. That's, I think, the highest number ever recorded since the creation of the euro. Core inflation, which strips out energy, was 3.9%. And what the forecast is calling for is 6.1% inflation this year before falling pretty significantly to 2.7% in 2023. Now, these are pretty big revisions. The 6.1% number is a upward revision of 3.5% from the winter forecast, and next year's number is up nearly 2 points. So let me stop and stop there for a bit.
So am I hearing you say that there's an expectation that energy prices will go down, and with that, that inflation is seen as a temporary issue?
Yeah, I think that policymakers are moving away from using the term transitory because we keep getting these shocks. But taken together, the COVID shock, the immediate spike in commodity prices from the war, these are supply side shocks. They're not going to last forever. We don't know exactly when they're going to go away, but we know that they're not going to last forever. And maybe one thing that I should add, because I think the audience here is largely Americans, and I think that in the United States, a lot of what's driving inflation higher in the United States is also supply side, the supply side of things, but there is a demand component as well. And in particular, the labor market in the United States is extremely tight, and people at the Fed in particular are worried about wage inflation. And in Europe, the response to the pandemic really succeeded in not just protecting jobs and incomes, but in keeping workers connected to their employers. Most member states used these existing short-time work schemes to subsidize incomes and keep people employed. And so when it was safe to go back to work, people had jobs. They had never lost their jobs. Whereas in the US, people lost their jobs. They got unemployment benefits. They got checks from the government. But when it was time to return to work, it meant getting a new job. And that's contributed to a lot of labor market churn and turnover in the United States. And in Europe, we have not seen that yet. Wage inflation, I think, I think the forecast for 2022 is for compensation to rise by 3.5%, which isn't keeping up with inflation. So in real terms, wages are still going down in Europe.
Yeah, but let's stick a little bit on inflation, and I want to bring Sander into the conversation. So how is the ECB looking at this dynamic, and what are you hearing at the Governing Council?
No, thanks a lot, Yvonne. I can subscribe in terms of the inflation picture a lot to what Ben has said. So maybe just to complement a bit before segueing into what the Governing Council has said. So essentially, if you compare the US and Europe, what you see is that core inflation is also much stronger in the US because there is a much stronger domestic demand component. So in this balance between supply shock and demand-driven recovery, the US has simply a lot more of the demand side also pulling inflation up. In particular, let's say via a strong labor market, but also if you look at rents, for example, they make up an important component of core inflation in the US. Whereas in Europe, what we're seeing at the moment is more, so like half the headline inflation is just straight up the energy price shock, and it's very much exacerbated by the war. And on the other hand, we see slower growth, and the Commission projections that Ben presented are more recent than the ones that we have. So, but if you look at that picture, you do see some of the energy prices feeding through already into, let's say, other types of inflation in Europe. So that includes, for example, transport. So in the services sector, even transport. But another dimension is also still the pandemic. So apart from China and the Ukraine war, you still have also the dynamic where, take restaurants, for example. They're reopening and demand is roaring back also in Europe for services. And it's difficult for some of these companies to hire people quickly enough to keep up. So you have these sort of local inflation booms in certain sectors that have very much to do with the reopening economy. So this is really the core picture that we see. And the Governing Council, against that backdrop, is really looking particularly at two dimensions. So one is what's happening on the labor market side and the wage growth side. And on the other hand, what's happening to so-called inflation expectations. So do we see that expectations over the forecast horizon are converging to our target of 2%? Or is there any evidence of a so-called de-anchoring where they're sort of out of whack and we're concerned? And basically on that front, on both sides, the picture is still relatively reassuring. So if you look at wage growth, as Ben said, even further out, it's around 3% or slightly above 3%, which is consistent with the 2% inflation target and a growth of 1 to 1.5%. So that's not particularly concerning, but it's something that's really at the forefront of the debate. And the other is on the expectations. And that is, in a sense, the good and the bad news from a central banking side. You see that they've converged to the ECB's target over the medium term. And at least for now, there's a lot of uncertainty. So that's important to point out. And that's really the backdrop against which the Governing Council has said that they are, depending on the data that come in this very uncertain environment, that in principle, they're looking at stopping net asset purchases in the third quarter of this year, again, with some caveat on the data that come in. And then key interest rates, which are currently in negative territory at minus 0.5%, would then be raised sometime after that. And that can be a matter of weeks or months. And those are, let's say, the key decision points that will be on the table for July. And I'm not in the Governing Council, so I cannot prejudge what they will decide. But if you look at market expectations, so let's say the ECB watcher community, what they expect the Governing Council to do, the average expectation is that they will raise rates in July by 25 basis points, so from minus 0.5 to minus 0.25. So I mean, that maybe gives you a bit of a picture on where the ECB stands and the thinking at the moment. And maybe to add that in this environment that's so uncertain, they have three guiding principles, which is gradualism, so not to move in very abrupt ways, flexibility, so to also be flexible in how we deploy the instruments so that the monetary impulse is passed on. And the last is optionality, so to really be data dependent, so what's happening to the economy, and to base the decisions, each decision cycle on that. So I'll stop there for now.
So what I'm hearing you say is there's a little bit of a disconnect. So on one side, you have the households who still are sitting on savings, because they have not been let go. They were connected to their job, and with that they were paid. And they also received some, government support. On the other side, we're dealing with slower growth, which I think is due to the concern in the market. I have higher, I think the Bund der Deutschen Industrie had a warning shot, sent a warning shot towards the Chancellor about cutting off Russian oil and gas supply, telling them that the input cost, for the manufacturing sector is going to shoot up with that, and that will then eventually be put onto the consumers. And in the meantime, I would assume that these companies are not spending or investing, I should say, as they had maybe planned at the end of last year or even the beginning of this year. So is that correct? Is there a disconnect between the household spending and corporate spending, and is that leading to weakness in the market, or how do you see that?
Yeah, I can also come in for that question if you want. So I will probably have some slides that I can link it to later on. But just at this point, I can say that yes. So in the forecast, we see that the both consumption and investments gonna prop up growth. And you're right in saying that consumption mostly comes from households, as fiscal policy is withdrawing some of the support that they have been giving during the pandemic, right? And also we assume that, or the European Commission assumes that the discretionary measures that they are providing for households to shield them a little bit from higher energy prices, they're gonna phase those out during the year. So we see that the fiscal policy is retreating this year, pretty much like in the US. But consumption, private consumption, household consumption is going to prop up growth going forward, as you say, as they start to consume their savings that they, from the income that they have been receiving in the past couple of years. Whereas for investments, what we see is that indeed corporate investments are hindered by the huge uncertainty, and they are hindered by the high production costs and input costs. But this is where also the Recovery and Resilience Fund comes in, where the new EU setup in reaction to the pandemic will step in with public investments. And this is also one of the implications of the Repower EU package that Ben has already referred to, is that many of the investments that relate to speeding up the green and digital transition will be front-loaded because of the idea that Europe should gain independence from Russian energy products. So actually, despite the fact that uncertainty and high production costs are sort of hindering investments, we don't think that the investments are going to be a drag on growth. On the opposite. So we think that together with public investments, and to be honest, the Recovery and Resilience Facility also provides opportunity for corporates to invest. I mean, they're going to be participating in the okay. So in technical terms, it will be an investment of the public, of the government, but they are going to be the ones who are delivering those investments on behalf of the government. So I think capital goods are going to be, capital investments are going to be high coming forward. And as you said, the household consumption, as they draw down their savings, is going to be supportive of growth. But I sort of jumped ahead of myself, and maybe I asked Ben to skip to the next slide to go into.
We can do that. But just if I could say one thing, just to be very explicit, business investment is going to be positive this year and next year. When we're talking about some of these constraints due to uncertainty, it's just that we're revising downwards slightly how much corporate investment we expect. But businesses are still broadly profitable and still planning on investing. They just might be delaying some of their investment decisions. So let me just say that. Now let's move on to the growth.
That's a good setup for.
If I can add to that, I'm seeing the exact same thing. I mean, people may be holding back a little bit, but they're ready for investment. I mean, related to, I mean, kind of like an outcome of all of this as well. You know, they're readjusting where they're doing business. They realize that the supply chain issues, you know, will be addressed, you know, in the medium term, and they're ready to invest and make a statement and, you know, do more business with friendly nations. So I think we had it in the title of the program. There's going to be a lot of investment between Europe and the United States, and it's just, you know, due to the uncertainty, held back a little bit, but I don't think it's going to be canceled out. Yeah. But I want to give it back to you, Balázs.
Yeah, I think that's I can also weave that into this slide, which is kind of technical, and I apologize for that. This shows basically, this is a breakdown of the growth figures into what is due to you know, growth being carried over from the previous year, and what is growth within that year. So you know, whoever has done forecasts before, they have probably come across with this idea of carryover effect. And what this is showing to, I mean, I think what I want you to take away from this slide, besides that it's very technical, is that it tells you about how optimistic the forecast of the European Commission, or how not so optimistic of the European Commission's forecast, in the sense that we hear a lot of times, you know, analysts and economists saying, well, Europe might be going into recession, the US might be going into recession, and then if you know, if someone just looks at the headline number of 2.7% for this year, one might think that this is overly optimistic. Well, this is not the case. This is a realistic forecast, I would say. This slide explains that to you, because it says the growth that comes from the previous year is around 2 percentage points. So what we think is that there's still considerable amount of growth coming from within this year. And we already seen that in the first quarter of the 2022 in the preliminary numbers. And again, in 2023, we even have more of the growth coming from within the year, you know, quarter to quarter increases. So I think this is the main message of this slide, is that the Commission forecast with the 2.7% growth for this year is not at all overly optimistic. I think it's a realistic forecast, and what you have been saying is that public investments, corporate investments, household consumption is going to prop up this forecast and make it realistic. I mean, maybe we could carry over to the next slide.
Can I ask you another question on the growth forecast? And this is on top of you know, pre-pandemic levels. There was some pent-up demand, you know, coming out of the pandemic, but now I think this also you know, takes that into consideration, and then adds on you know, investments that were held up and are now also supported by the resilience and recovery and resilience facility. Isn't that all kind of coming together into that mix?
That is absolutely correct. So I think, yeah, it's important to point out that in 2021 Q4, so end of last year, the EU as a whole has returned to pre-pandemic GDP levels, meaning that the EU has come out of recovery and is now in before the war, it was an expansion phase. So you could already expect that growth is going to slow down just because of the cyclical effects, right? You're no longer in recovery, you're in expanding phase, where growth is usually smaller than the recovery. So these were the sort of the original forecast in the winter that was published just before the Russian war in Ukraine. And what comes on top, as you say, is that even with the downward revision due to the war and say renewed lockdown measures in China, even despite those factors, there's additional growth coming in within this year and next year. So I think that's a very relevant point.
Yeah, the economic fundamentals in Europe were very strong heading into this year before the war. So the war has scrambled the outlook a bit, but you have a very strong labor market. You have really solid household and business balance sheets. There's a large stock of excess savings that has not yet been spent by consumers. And you have a fiscal impetus that, you know, while the huge scale of the support that we saw during the pandemic is now shrinking, fiscal is still a net positive for growth. So you still have these tailwinds. They're just a couple of additional headwinds that have come because of the Russian invasion. But here you can see, you know, the unemployment rate in Europe is as low as it's ever been. The labor market's really strong.
Yeah. So I mean, as Ben was pointing out, so the strong labor market, which is already there end of last year, it's continuing despite all these shocks that are you know, hitting the EU economy. The strong labor market is going to continue this year and the next, and that's going to give us the sufficient underpinning for the household consumption that we have already talked about. So actually, just to again give you a few numbers, or maybe just an idea of what we're talking about. So the headcount employment figures in the EU have been growing for 3 quarters in a row last year, and they have reached historic highs. So that's also shows you how strong the labor market it actually is. So basically the pandemic-induced slack that was in the labor market has been reabsorbed by the end of last year, and you could say that the labor market continues to function in a very good manner. And Ben has already alluded to the difference between how supportive measures were enacted in EU and the US, but in response to the pandemic, and that's also giving us a sort of comfort in that that labor supply is still, the employees are still attached to their employers, to their workplaces, and that helps them, you know, that helps the economies to avoid frictions in the labor market, and therefore we can be confident that this will continue going on. I mean,
are you confident that we're not going to face the same issue that we have here in the US, where you know, this will increase salaries and with that production cost?
Again, I mean, Ben has mostly already given all the punchlines that I had. So basically, he said already like the wage development going forward. So I think I believe that last year, I believe that by the end of 21 compared to end of 2020, compensation of employees have risen by about 4%. But that's sort of that number is somewhat distorted by the short-term work schemes, and negotiated wages actually grew by only 1.6% in that same period. So that means that the wage pressures are not as strong in the EU as they seem to be in the US. And I think that there's sort of this attachment to the employer, and you know, not wanting to lose your job is a stronger effect in the EU than sort of the intention or the pressure to negotiate higher wages. So this is somehow a difference between how labor markets work in the two sides of the Atlantics. So I think whereas there are wage increases, these wage increases are not really threatening our inflation forecast, of going into like a spiral effect.
One comment from the audience, which I think is interesting. So the labor market and the legal situation in terms of hiring and firing are quite diverse across Europe. Do you see, I mean, while overall the labor market is strong, do you see some countries where you're concerned that they may be, I don't want to say left behind, but they may be more challenged than others?
I mean, obviously, the labor markets across the EU differ quite significantly, but this is a general trend that the labor market was strong across the EU. So this sort of projection and idea that we have about how labor markets will continue functioning in the next couple of years is pretty uniform across the EU. I mean, the exact figures will differ. For example, the unemployment rate in Germany is below 3%, whereas it's much higher in say Spain or other countries. So there's some heterogeneity for sure, but the general idea that the labor market continues to be strong is relevant across the entire EU.
You know, one of the things that's interesting that's happening on both sides of the Atlantic is that as people feel safer venturing out and pandemic restrictions end, you're seeing this shift in away from consumption of goods towards the consumption of services. And in European economies like Spain and Italy and Greece that are have very big tourism sectors, this is hugely positive, right? Like suddenly people are taking trips and they're going out to restaurants, and so there's lots of job growth, and it'll be interesting to see how much labor market pressure there is there. I imagine that that's one of the things that the ECB is going to be watching as they watch the incoming data comes in. But on the other side of things, these ongoing supply chain disruptions and commodity price shocks aren't that great for the manufacturing sector, right? Like it's a problem there. So there's going to be, divergence, not just across member states, but across sectors.
Yeah, you're taking the words right out of my mouth. I was wondering, if that's the reasoning behind the ECB, maybe going to from the 0.5 to 0.25, but not quite willing to get rid of the negative interest rates because they want consumers to stay out there until the end of the year and spend.
That's a provocative way. I mean, we look at the totality of the picture. But maybe just to add a bit of some data on some of the points that Ben and Balázs made. I mean, on wage growth, so if you net out all these temporary work schemes, these furlough schemes, and you look at wage growth, so you sort of strip out all these difficult to measure effects, wage growth is around 2.3%. So which is in line with the pre-pandemic average. And so that's one of the things where you say that underpins, let's say, the ECB's assessment of going gradual and remaining optionality to see how that goes going forward. But it's nowhere near the dynamic in the US that the Fed is looking at, where wages are growing above the pre-pandemic trend, and that's a concern for them. So that's one. And the other point that I wanted to add is just, in a sense, this very large stock of household savings that was mentioned before, and there are different estimates, but it's likely for the Eurozone somewhere up to 900 billion, of which 450 billion in let's say relatively liquid bank accounts and so on. That's of course also in a sense an insurance or a buffer against this still maybe temporary but quite significant inflation spike. So that's one of the elements that Ben mentioned that I just wanted to add a bit of volume on, which is, I mean, 900 billion is bigger than the Dutch economy, which is one of the bigger ones in the Eurozone. So it's a significant amount, and it helps support the ongoing recovery, even if slower than before, given the war. So.
Interesting.
Yeah.
Ben? Unemployment. We're finishing up on the unemployment picture.
Oh yeah. So you were calling on me. You were cutting out. So.
Did we lose Balázs? I can't see him anymore.
Yeah, we get. Yes, we can hear you.
Oh, okay. So I don't know what's going on. Yeah. So so you were talking about unemployment, right? I was sorry. Okay. So then, as Sander just said, the strong labor market is going to, and the drawdown of savings is going to support the housing market, and that's basically the slide that okay, you had that before. So maybe just for this slide, just to wrap up, what I wanted to say is that basically we have a forecast which has been revised down due to the impact of Russia's war in Ukraine, obviously, which is, one could say that by and large the entire revision could be attributed to that impact. And to some extent to the different lockdown measures in China and supply chain difficulties, but by and large this was the reason for the downgrade. But these negative headwinds, basically this is previously a downside risk has materialized, but there are some upside risks still there. So there's going to be consumption smoothing, as we discussed. So the strong labor market, the strong savings rate is going to keep pushing growth higher. Investment projects in the context of the recovery and resilience facility, but also private investments is going to push growth higher. And all the reopening dynamics that we're seeing, and all the discretionary measures, as Ben has said before, like fiscal policy is still a net positive. So these measures continue to support and prop up growth in the EU. So I wouldn't be entirely pessimistic on the forecast in that respect. Yeah, so this is a slide that I was just talking about. And of course, there's differences across the EU in terms of growth numbers. Obviously, there's the impact of the war and the sanctions that the EU and the US have enacted are going to affect the growth in different countries differently. We see, or we can also forecast that the Eastern European countries and Baltic countries are more exposed to Russia, and they have a bigger, trade with Russia. They are more reliant on energy products coming from Russia. So obviously, these countries are going to be much more affected than say those countries who are more self-reliant on energy. So
I have another question on GDP. Does the growth within expected GDP correlate in any way with a macro sense of vertical integration in the EU?
I mean, so if I got the question correctly, you're asking whether the supply chains, whether the growth would be related to how self-reliant countries are, whether they get supplies from abroad. And yes, one can say yes. The more open a country is, the more trade they do with not just Russia but the rest of the world, which is obviously the repercussions from the war is affecting other countries as well, not just EU countries. Those countries which are more open to trade are going to be more affected by this shock, for sure.
Yep, thank you. So let's talk about the Recovery and Resilience Facility, how this is going to address some of the aspects that go into that. The green transition, digital transition, and then I would like, to talk a little bit about Repower EU, the new initiative that I think Ursula von der Leyen announced yesterday afternoon, to top up the investment into the green transition. Who wants to take the lead on that?
Maybe I'll introduce a couple of things. I mean, first of all, I think it's become very clear that diversifying away from Russian fossil fuel imports is not just a climate change issue. I mean, obviously, climate change is an important, combating climate change is an important component, but it's really about security, both in a military sense and in an economic sense for Europe. And this is going to be expensive, and it's going to require a lot of investment. But as luck would have it, one of the important things about the Recovery and Resilience Facility is that it already provides this framework in return for grants and also loans that must be, about 40 to 50%. I think they're in the process of upping the percentage that's supposed to go to green energy investments. But in return for EU money that will go towards spending, improving electricity grids, building LNG platforms and new pipelines and things like that. There are these, structural reforms that countries have to take that will boost productivity and make their economy stronger in the long run. But in the short term, this is macroeconomically significant numbers, and that's what this chart shows. And maybe I'll leave things there and let Balázs jump in. But the Repower EU initiative, because the RRF is already there, there's guidelines and there's a sort of a platform that you can just plug Repower EU in to accelerate this transition, make it happen as soon as possible. But let me see if Balázs wants to weigh in here.
Yeah, I think what you've mentioned about the Recovery and Resilience Facility, that it is not only about money. Obviously, it is about money and it's sizable amounts, but it's also very much about structural reforms. I think it's very important because right now to get the EU off from Russian energy, probably investments are one of the most important things. So they, LNG ports or terminals and other alternative or renewable energy production is something that we need to develop faster than we have previously thought because of this shock. But in the longer term, we also need structural reforms, and this is what the RRF is very strong in. So I'd like to emphasize that part. I mean, also the Repower EU is also not just about investments, but it's also about those technologies that help us save energy. So it's just not consuming as much. That's also a way to wean ourselves off from Russian energy, and also about diversifying sources. And in the end, you're right. So these measures getting rid of Russian energy will mean that there's the price of energy is probably going to go even higher. But we seem to be able to handle that. Like already, governments have been supporting households to weather this energy hike that we have seen in the recent months.
Yeah, I was just going to say, I mean, the getting rid of dirty energy in general, not just Russian oil, that has been a push in the past. So that has been already factored into the Recovery and Resilience Facility and into the last forecast as well, wasn't it? I mean, the investments that have to be made to make that possible.
That's right, but we're trying to do it faster and with some additional financing behind it. So, I mean, Repower EU, I think it adds about 210 billion euros in additional financing on top of what was already available through the RRF. So the aim, first of all, is to phase out oil imports from Russia for almost every member state by the end of the year. There's a couple Eastern European countries that are, it's not easy to find a solution because they're tied into Russian pipelines and they don't have any easily accessible alternatives. So they're going to get an extra year or two. But for the most part, oil imports are going to end by the end of the year. And this makes the discussion of natural gas more critical, right? Because that can't happen quite that soon. because it's, LNG ports where they're very expensive to build, and you can build them, but it'll take you a year or two, and you also have to get, secure contracts for LNG supplies from somewhere else in the world. So all this money is going to go towards a combination of things, of like rebuilding pipelines, building new LNG facilities, but also, improving the electricity grid so that countries that have excess electrical generating capacity can send it to countries that are finding their supplies cut off. So maybe just to quickly summarize, there's like 3 initiatives in Repower EU that aim to like accelerate the transition away from Russian energy and to boost the promotion of renewable energy supplies. So you've got a move towards increased energy efficiency, and there's a lot of components to the energy efficiency, and reducing demand in the short term for natural gas, I think, is the most critical, because the EU needs to build up its stocks of gas in anticipation of the winter, because there's still a lot of homes that use gas-fired furnaces to heat their homes, and you don't, notwithstanding shades of Jimmy Carter, like, we don't really want everyone just to be doubling up on sweaters this winter to keep warm. Like, that's not quite good enough. But like improving insulation and moving towards more electric vehicles and more public transportation, things like that are in the energy efficiency part of the initiatives. Getting new gas and hydrogen supplies from the North Sea and from the Mediterranean, from elsewhere in the world. Like, already, I think. Russia, what are some of the, hold on, I have some numbers here. Russia was supplying about 40% of EU natural gas imports last year and about 25% of oil. So these are pretty significant moves we're talking about, and Europe needs to find suppliers from other parts of the world. Now, the US is going to be part of that. The US was already exporting oil and gas to Europe, and I think looking at imports, the US, I think, supplied 7% of natural gas and 8% of the EU's oil last year. Presumably those numbers are going to go up, as well as from places like OPEC countries and Norway that has large reserves in the North Sea. But you also need new infrastructure to handle this. And then in terms of like renewables, Europe wants to, for example, double installed solar capacity by 2025. And install something like 600 gigawatts of solar by 2030. So there's going to be money for that, and there's also going to be some regulatory pushes in terms of expanding emissions trading schemes and expanding carbon credits to sectors that didn't have them before. So let me see. I don't know if you guys want to come in on some of this stuff.
I think this is pretty comprehensive. I just wanted to add that also on hydrogen, the EU and the solar energy. So I think the EU wants to be still a leader in these 2 fields. So there's a bunch of capacity that the EU is planning in the context of this Repower EU package that the EU is planning on putting online pretty quickly.
I mean, since we have 7 minutes left, I would like to be sure we address the question of unity, because that's part of the title of our program today, or the theme. Can all 3 of you make a comment about what this situation is telling us about the unity within Europe, and what it is telling us, about the strength of the partnership between Europe and the US. Sander, do you want to get started on that?
Sure, I'm happy to start on that. Maybe a nice hook into the last topic, which is Next Generation EU, the Recovery Resilience Facility. Because I think for me that very much embodies, as a central banker, how far we've come as Europe, and the fact that we have now a huge public investment vehicle that's collectively funded, and that's basically making now a particularly geopolitically smart investment in green energy, but not across the board equal, but in places where it's most needed. is a really major innovation, and it solves in its design some of the issues we had with crises before in Europe, which was that public investment would collapse during recessions. And at this stage, we now have a European tool which is both providing investments but also pulling in other private investments. So that's a really important point from a macro perspective. And it comes from political unity, because it was a political decision by the EU leaders to establish this common fiscal action. So I think that's really kind of a reassuring thing. And if you look at the rounds of sanctions that have been passed one after the other, which are in some respects at least short-term economically costly for Europe, and still it's done. So I think if the glass is half full or half empty, and outside commentators often say, well, look, how can these 27 countries agree on anything? It's rather remarkable how much they agree on and how fast in the crisis we've had in the last 2 years. So I'll stop with that thought. Thank you.
Ben, Balázs?
I totally agree. I think since the pandemic has erupted, or since the pandemic came about in 2020, the EU 27 has taken decisions that we never thought would be possible, especially in such a short time. So the Recovery and Resilience Facility is one example, but also the so far 5 packages, and now the proposal for the sixth sanction package is something that we didn't think that was possible. So what shows unity if not these landmark measures that the EU has taken in the past couple of years?
And Ben, as the American?
Yeah, so I'd also like to add here, I think one of the great historical triumphs of the European project is that back when the Berlin Wall fell and Soviet troops pulled back from the Iron Curtain, there were all these newly independent, I mean, nominally they were independent before, but they had been occupied by the Red Army. So you had these newly independent countries in Eastern Europe, and they did not have democracies or capitalist economies in place. And the EU provided this framework for how to build a modern, liberal, free market economy. And, looking back now, when you look at Poland or the Czech Republic, or, Hungary, Romania, I mean, they haven't quite reached Western levels of wealth, but they've done hugely well over the past generation. And that's thanks to this set of rules of law and institutions, and also aid that's come from Europe in rebuilding these economies and making these institutions. And this is what is about to happen again with Ukraine. And it's both, there's this old joke about liquor being the cause of and solution to all of life's problems. Well, I think that for Ukraine, it's the reason that Russia was invaded Ukraine is because they didn't want Ukraine joining the West. They didn't want Ukraine joining Europe and becoming a liberal democracy with free markets and the rule of law. And so now Ukraine has been incredibly successful in fighting off, many of the initial invasions. I mean, they're still fighting quite hard, and we don't know what's going to happen, but it's looking like they could win, or at least that they're going to survive as a country. And Europe is about to step in and provide, very significant macro financial aid along with the United States. I mean, there's this $40 billion aid package going through Congress right now. Europe has been announcing, I think they've just announced this package of 9 billion euros in new loans. But it's not just money. They are going to provide the technical assistance and the administrative support in partnership with the European government to reconstruct the Ukrainian economy once the war finally is over. And I think that this is a great example, not just of transatlantic cooperation, but of, why the European project is so appealing to, neighborhood countries and to, people around the world. And it's a model for how to grow and build institutions and create, better lives for people.
And that's definitely something that Europe and the United States have in common. It's the bond that unites us. So I think, let's leave that as the last word, Ben. And with that, we conclude today's webinar. Thank you to our panelists and to our audience for joining us today. If you are EACC member and you would like to connect with any of the other participants, we're happy to facilitate that while we're still doing webinars. We have a couple of really interesting programs coming up. AI data analysis in the changing tax landscape, workforce challenges, risk as a mosaic, and fighting sanction evasion. We will send out a summary of upcoming programs after this event, and you will be able to listen to a recording of this discussion or send it to your colleagues and friends if they haven't been able to attend. A link to the channel, to the YouTube channel, will be on the EACC website. So with that, I would like to thank everybody, and also our panel again for putting this program together with us and sharing the insights on the economic update. Very curious to hear the next one in the fall and see how our predictions have been going.
Thanks very much, Yvonne. Always a pleasure.
Thank you, everybody.